I should have known better than to accept a ride from a stranger in a black Maserati. But when you're stranded at midnight in the worst part of Chicago with a dead phone and empty pockets, desperation makes you stupid. And what I didn't know in that moment, what I couldn't possibly have known as I stood shivering under the flickering streetlight with my scrubs still smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion seeping into my bones, was that the devastatingly handsome man behind the wheel wasn't just any stranger. He was Dante Valorian, the most feared Mafia boss in the city. And his kindness came with a price I couldn't begin to imagine. A price that would ultimately cost me everything I thought I knew about myself and the world I believed I understood. The night had started like any other grueling shift at Chicago Memorial Hospital, where I worked as a nursing student assistant, pulling double shifts to pay for tuition that seemed to multiply every semester while my bank account performed the opposite miracle of shrinking into nothing. And I had been so focused on getting through my rounds, so determined to prove to Dr. Patterson that I deserved the recommendation letter he'd promised for my application to the accelerated nursing program, that I hadn't noticed how the hours had slipped away like water through my fingers until I was rushing out the employee entrance at 11:45, my sneakers squeaking against the rain-slicked pavement as I sprinted toward the bus stop 3 blocks away, my heart pounding with the knowledge that the last bus to my neighborhood left at midnight, and there wouldn't be another until 5 in the morning. I had pushed my exhausted body into a run that made my lungs burn and my legs scream in protest, because missing that bus meant waiting in one of the most dangerous parts of the city for 5 hours. And even though I tried to tell myself that I'd be fine, that I'd survived worse, that I could just sit in the 24-hour diner on the corner and nurse a cup of coffee until dawn, some instinct deep in my gut whispered that tonight was different, that the shadows seemed darker and more menacing than usual, that the groups of men loitering on street corners were watching me with a predatory interest that made my skin crawl with primitive warning. I had rounded the corner onto Ashland Avenue with 2 minutes to spare, my breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged in the cold November air, only to see the taillights of the bus disappearing into the distance, and the sound that escaped my throat was something between a sob and a scream of frustration. Because of course this would happen tonight. Of course the universe would decide that after a 16-hour shift, where I'd held the hand of a dying woman and cleaned up more bodily fluids than I cared to remember, I deserved one more kick while I was down. I had stood there for a long moment, just staring at the empty street and trying to decide what to do, whether to risk the walk home through neighborhoods where gunshots were as common as car horns, or to shell out money I didn't have for an Uber. Except my phone had died an hour ago, because I'd forgotten to charge it the night before, and the crushing weight of my own stupidity settled over me like a heavy blanket as I realized I was well and truly stranded, with nothing but my nursing school ID, my dead phone, and $7 in crumpled bills that wouldn't even cover a cab to the safer part of town. The street had been mostly empty, just a few cars passing by with their windows rolled up and their doors locked, their drivers carefully avoiding eye contact, with the exhausted girl in scrubs standing alone at a bus stop. And I had been so lost in my own spiral of anxiety and self-recrimination that I hadn't noticed the group of men detaching themselves from the shadows across the street until they were already halfway to me, their laughter carrying an edge of menace that made every instinct I possessed scream at me to run. There had been 4 of them, wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as members of one of the street gangs that controlled this territory, and the way they moved toward me with that casual confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go made my blood turn to ice in my veins, and I had been calculating my chances of making it back to the hospital before they caught me, when the black Maserati had pulled up to the curb beside me with a purr of expensive engine that seemed completely out of place in this forgotten corner of the city. The window had rolled down with barely a whisper of sound, revealing a man who looked like he'd stepped out of some dark fantasy, all sharp cheekbones and intense dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to my terrified soul. His black hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his suit probably costing more than I made in 6 months. And when he'd spoken, his voice had been smooth and cultured with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place, wrapping around me like expensive silk that could just as easily become a noose. "You look like you could use a ride, Alessia," he had said. And the fact that he knew my name when I'd never seen him before in my life should have sent me running in the opposite direction, should have triggered every warning bell and red flag and survival instinct I possessed. But the group of men was getting closer, their intentions written clearly in their hungry eyes and predatory grins, and sometimes the devil you don't know seems preferable to the devils who are close enough to touch. I had hesitated for only a moment, my hand already reaching for the door handle even as my brain screamed that this was a terrible idea, that getting into a stranger's car was exactly how girls ended up on the evening news. But the tallest of the approaching men had called out something crude and vile that made my stomach turn, and suddenly the beautiful stranger in the Maserati seemed like the lesser of two evils, so I had yanked open the door and slid into the leather seat that probably cost more than my entire apartment, pulling the door shut with a solid thunk that felt like sealing my fate. The interior of the car had smelled like expensive cologne and something darker, something dangerous that I couldn't quite identify. And the moment the door closed, the man had pressed the gas pedal, and we were gliding away from the curb with a smoothness that made it feel like we were floating. And I had watched through the passenger window as the group of men stopped in their tracks, their aggressive postures suddenly shifting to something that looked almost like fear, as they recognized either the car or the man driving it. And that should have been my first real clue that I had just traded one nightmare for something potentially worse. "Thank you," I had managed to say, my voice coming out smaller and more fragile than I intended. And I had turned to look at my rescuer properly for the first time, really taking in the sharp angles of his face, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with casual confidence, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist, the air of dangerous power that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire, and I had felt my breath catch in my throat because he was possibly the most beautiful man I had ever seen, beautiful in the way that fallen angels must be beautiful, all dark allure and terrible grace. "You should be more careful, Alessia Romano," he had replied, his eyes never leaving the road as we turned onto Lakeshore Drive, heading toward the lakefront where the lights of the city reflected off the dark water. And the way he said my full name with such intimate familiarity made my skin prickle with warning. Because how did he know that? How did he know anything about me? And I had opened my mouth to ask him exactly that when he continued, "A girl like you shouldn't be wandering around that neighborhood at midnight, especially not when your brother has made such powerful enemies who would love nothing more than to use you as leverage." The words had hit me like a physical blow, driving all the air from my lungs and making my heart stutter in my chest. Because Luca, my stupid, reckless brother who couldn't stay away from the poker tables and the sports books and every other way to throw away money we didn't have, what had he done now? What had he gotten himself into that had strangers knowing my name and watching my movements, and the fear that flooded through me was different from the fear I'd felt standing on that street corner. This was deeper and colder, and so much worse because it meant that whatever trouble Luca had found, it had followed him home to our doorstep. "I don't know what you're talking about." I had tried to lie, but my voice shook and betrayed me, and the man had finally turned to look at me properly, his dark eyes finding mine with an intensity that made me feel pinned in place like a butterfly on a collector's board. And there was something in his gaze that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a kind of focused attention that made me feel like I was the only thing in the world that mattered to him in that moment. "Don't insult either of us with dishonesty, Alessia," he had said, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost intimate in the confined space of the car. And I had noticed for the first time that he had very slight scars on his knuckles, the kind that came from hitting things or people repeatedly. And the contrast between his cultured voice and expensive suit and those telltale marks of violence made him somehow even more frightening. "Your brother owes a substantial amount of money to some very unforgiving people, and they will come to collect that debt one way or another. And when they do, they won't particularly care that you've been working yourself to exhaustion trying to pay for medical school. They won't be moved by the fact that you've sacrificed everything to take care of a brother who barely appreciates you. They'll simply see another asset to be exploited, another way to apply pressure until they get what they want." I had felt tears burning behind my eyes, hot and shameful, because how dare this stranger, this beautiful, terrifying stranger, see straight through to all my private pain and frustration? How dare he voice the resentment I barely allowed myself to feel toward Luca, who I'd raised after our parents died, who I'd protected and provided for and loved despite everything, and I had wanted to defend my brother, to explain that he wasn't a bad person, just a weak one. But the words stuck in my throat because what was the point of defending him to a man who clearly already knew everything? "Who are you?" I had finally asked, the question coming out as barely more than a whisper. And we had pulled up in front of my apartment building, which was laughable really because of course he knew where I lived. Of course he'd known my address before I'd even gotten in the car, and he had shifted in his seat to face me fully, his arm draped casually over the steering wheel, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the street lamps. "My name is Dante Valorian," he had said, watching my face carefully as if expecting recognition. And at first the name meant nothing to me because I lived in a world of textbooks and patient charts and double shifts. But then fragments of overheard conversations came back to me. Whispers among the other nurses about the Italian families who ran the city from the shadows, about a young boss who had consolidated power with ruthless efficiency, about a man who people spoke of with the kind of fearful respect usually reserved for natural disasters. And my hands had started shaking because I understood now that I wasn't just in a car with a dangerous man. I was in a car with the most dangerous man in Chicago. "I know what you're thinking," he had continued, his voice softening slightly as if he could read my thoughts on my face. "And you're right to be afraid. But I'm not the one you need to fear, Alessia. The people your brother has entangled himself with, they're the real threat. And they'll be coming for you very soon, probably sooner than you realize." He had reached into his jacket pocket then, and I had flinched instinctively, some part of me expecting a weapon. But instead he had pulled out a black business card made of what looked like heavy cardstock, with nothing on it but a phone number embossed in silver. And he had taken my hand, his fingers warm and strong and sending an involuntary shiver up my arm, and pressed the card into my palm, closing my fingers around it with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. "When they come, and they will come," he had said, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a gesture that felt both threatening and protective. "You call that number, and I'll make sure you're protected. But Alessia, understand that my protection comes with expectations, with obligations that you may not be prepared to fulfill, so you should think very carefully before you dial those digits." I had wanted to throw the card back at him, to tell him that I didn't need his help or his protection, that I would handle my brother's mess the same way I'd handled everything else in my life, through sheer stubborn determination and an unwillingness to give up. But something in his eyes stopped me. Some knowing look that suggested he could see my future more clearly than I could, that he already knew how this story would unfold. And so I had simply nodded and stumbled out of the car, with my legs feeling weak and uncertain beneath me. I had stood on the sidewalk watching as he drove away, the Maserati's taillights disappearing around the corner, and I had looked down at the black card in my hand, at the silver numbers that seemed to gleam with their own sinister light. And I had told myself that I would throw it away, that I would never call that number no matter what happened, that I would find another way to fix Luca's problems without getting entangled with a man like Dante Valorian. But when I had climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my apartment, exhaustion making each step feel like climbing a mountain, and pushed open my door to find my home completely ransacked, furniture overturned, and drawers emptied, and belongings scattered across the floor, like the aftermath of a violent storm. And when I had seen the message spray-painted across my living room wall in angry red letters that screamed, "Your brother owes us, you'll pay," I had understood with horrible clarity that Dante had been right about everything, that the wolves were already at my door, and that the black card in my trembling hand might be the only lifeline between me and complete destruction. I had spent the entire night sitting on my overturned couch with my knees pulled up to my chest and my eyes fixed on the door, jumping at every sound in the building, every creak of the pipes and footstep in the hallway. My fingers wrapped so tightly around the black business card that the edges had left red marks in my palm, and I had told myself over and over that I wouldn't call him, that I would find another way out of this nightmare. Even as the spray-painted threat on my wall seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the darkness, reminding me with every glance that I was living on borrowed time. The morning had brought no relief, only the harsh reality of surveying the damage in the cold light of day, seeing how thoroughly they had violated my space, how they had torn through my modest belongings looking for something valuable enough to claim as payment. And the worst part wasn't the broken picture frames, or the scattered clothes, or even the slashed cushions leaking stuffing onto the floor. It was the realization that they had gone through everything, including the shoebox in my closet where I kept my mother's jewelry, the only things I had left of her. And they had taken it all, every piece, as if my memories and my grief were just another asset to be liquidated. I had called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, my voice hollow and distant when I spoke to the charge nurse, and then I had tried calling Luca approximately 15 times, my anger and fear building with each call that went straight to voicemail, because of course he wasn't answering. Of course he was hiding somewhere while I dealt with the consequences of his addiction and his weakness. And I had left messages that started out concerned and progressively became more furious, demanding that he call me back immediately, that he explain what he had done and who he owed and how much, though some part of me already knew that the number would be devastating. I had spent the day trying to clean up the destruction, attempting to restore some semblance of order to my violated sanctuary. But every time I picked up something broken, or tried to right a piece of overturned furniture, I found myself freezing in place, my hands shaking and my breath coming too fast, because what was the point of cleaning when they could come back at any moment? When the door I had hastily tried to secure with a chair wedged under the handle would do nothing to stop men who had already proven they had no respect for boundaries or safety, or the basic human dignity of leaving a working student alone. The sun had been setting, painting my ransacked apartment in shades of orange and red that seemed ominous rather than beautiful, when I heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway outside my door, multiple sets of feet moving with purpose rather than the casual gait of my elderly neighbors, and I had felt my heart drop into my stomach because I just knew with horrible certainty that they had come back, and this time they weren't here to leave a message. The pounding on my door had been aggressive and demanding, making the thin wood rattle in its frame, and a heavily accented voice had called out in Russian that I had 30 seconds to open the door or they would break it down, and I had stood frozen in the middle of my destroyed living room, my mind racing through impossible options, because I could try to run, but my apartment was on the 4th floor, and there was no fire escape. I could try to hide, but where would I go that they wouldn't find me? I could try to fight, but I was one exhausted nursing student against what sounded like at least 2 grown men who did violence for a living. The door had splintered on the 3rd kick, the chair I had wedged under the handle going flying across the room, and then they were inside. 2 massive men who seemed to fill my small apartment with their bulk and their menace, dressed in dark clothes that looked tactical and expensive, their faces hard and cold in a way that suggested they had done this many times before and felt nothing resembling sympathy or hesitation, and the taller one had smiled at me with teeth that seemed too white and too sharp, like a shark who had just spotted blood in the water. "Alessia Romano," he had said, pronouncing my name with a thickness that made it sound foreign and frightening, and he had pulled out his phone to show me a picture of Luca, my stupid, reckless brother who looked terrified in the photo, his face bruised and his eye swollen shut, and the Russian had continued in his heavily accented English. "Your brother. He owes Kozlov organization $150,000, plus interest that grows every day he does not pay. And now this debt, it becomes your responsibility, because family, they pay for family, yes." I had felt the room spinning around me, the number so impossibly large that my brain couldn't even process it properly. Because how had Luca accumulated that kind of debt? How long had he been gambling with these people? And more importantly, how did they expect me to pay it when I was barely scraping by on my nursing assistant salary and student loans that would take me decades to repay? And I had opened my mouth to tell them exactly that, to explain that I didn't have that kind of money and never would. But the second Russian had moved closer to me, invading my space in a way that made my skin crawl with primal fear. And he had reached out to touch my hair with fingers that smelled like cigarettes and violence. "Is okay, pretty girl," he had said, his smile revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the fading light. "You don't have money, we understand. But you are young and beautiful, and there are many ways to work off debt. Many men who would pay good price for a girl like you, fresh and clean and educated. So you come with us now. We take you somewhere safe where you can start earning. And maybe in a few years, debt is paid and you are free." The words had penetrated my panic-frozen brain slowly, and when I understood what he was suggesting, what they planned to do with me, the fear transformed into something sharper and more desperate, because I had heard stories about girls who disappeared into that world, about how they were broken and brutalized until there was nothing left of who they used to be. And I would rather die than let them take me, would rather throw myself out the window than submit to that fate. And my hand had found the black business card in my pocket, where I had been carrying it like a talisman all day. And I had made a decision that would change everything. My phone had somehow ended up in my shaking hands, and I had been dialing the number from the card before I even consciously decided to do it, my fingers moving with desperate urgency while the Russians watched with amusement, probably thinking I was calling the police, who they knew wouldn't arrive in time and wouldn't care enough about a girl from this neighborhood anyway. And the phone had rung only once, before a smooth, cultured voice answered with simply, "Alessia," as if he had been waiting for my call, as if he had known exactly how long it would take for his prediction to come true. "They're here," I had managed to choke out, my voice breaking on the words. "The Russians, they're in my apartment, they want to take me, they said—" But I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible fate they had planned for me. And there had been a moment of silence on the other end of the line, a pause that felt charged with dangerous energy, before Dante had spoken again, his voice dropping into a register that was somehow both reassuring and absolutely terrifying. "Put the tall one on the phone," he had commanded, and there was something in his tone that left no room for argument. So I had extended my phone toward the Russian with the gold tooth, my hand trembling so badly I almost dropped it, and I had said with as much steadiness as I could muster, "He wants to talk to you." The Russian had taken the phone with a smirk, probably expecting to dismiss whatever threat was coming. But I had watched as his expression changed within seconds, the arrogant amusement draining away to be replaced by something that looked like genuine fear, his face going pale under his tan as he listened to whatever Dante was saying. And he had responded in rapid Russian that sounded defensive and apologetic. And then he had thrust the phone back at me as if it had burned him, gesturing urgently to his companion, and they had both backed toward my broken door with their hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You tell Valorian we didn't know," the tall Russian had said, his accent thicker now with stress. "We didn't know you were under his protection. This changes everything. The debt. It is between the bosses now, not our business anymore." And then they were gone, disappearing down the hallway with a speed that seemed impossible for men of their size, leaving me standing in my destroyed apartment with the phone still pressed to my ear and my entire body shaking with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. "Alessia, are you hurt?" Dante's voice had come through the phone, pulling me back from the edge of panic, and I had shaken my head before remembering he couldn't see me, managing to whisper that I was okay, that they had left, and he had made a sound that was almost like relief before his voice hardened again into something commanding and absolute. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't open the door for anyone except me. I'm sending my men to collect you. They'll be there in less than 10 minutes. And Alessia, this conversation we're about to have, the offer I'm about to make you, I need you to listen carefully and understand that I'm the only thing standing between you and a fate so much worse than you can imagine." The line had gone dead before I could respond, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my life with the understanding that I had just crossed a threshold I could never uncross. That by making that call, I had bound myself to Dante Valorian in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And I had sunk down onto my slashed couch and waited. Because what else could I do? Where else could I go when the monsters had been scared away by an even bigger monster who now held all the cards? True to his word, there had been a knock on my door exactly 8 minutes later, and when I had peered through the peephole, I had seen 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they could break someone in half without breaking a sweat, and they had identified themselves as Dante's security. Their voices respectful and professional in a way that was somehow more unsettling than the Russians' open aggression. And I had gathered my backpack with my laptop and textbooks, and a few changes of clothes, taking one last look at my destroyed apartment, and understanding that I was leaving behind more than just a physical space. I was leaving behind my independence and my illusions of safety, and any pretense that I was in control of my own life. The drive to wherever they were taking me had been silent except for the purr of the engine, the 2 men not speaking to me or to each other, and I had watched the city pass by outside the tinted windows, seeing the neighborhoods change from rundown to transitional to wealthy, with a speed that represented years of economic climbing, condensed into minutes of driving. And then we were pulling up to a high-rise that overlooked Lake Michigan, the kind of building where the doorman wore a uniform and the lobby had marble floors and fresh flowers, and I was being escorted to a private elevator that required a key card to access the penthouse level. The elevator had opened directly into an apartment that was less a home and more a palace, all floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the lake that stretched to the horizon, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, art on the walls that I suspected were originals worth more than my entire education, and standing by the windows with his back to me, silhouetted against the lights of the city, was Dante Valorian. And when he turned to face me, I had been struck again by how impossibly beautiful he was, how his dark suit fit him like it had been made specifically for his body, which it probably had, how his eyes found mine across the space with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered to him. "Alessia," he had said, moving toward me with a grace that seemed almost predatory, and he had dismissed his men with a subtle gesture, leaving us alone in his fortress in the sky. "I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you called me, and I'm sorry that it came to this. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. The Kozlov organization is one of the most brutal and unforgiving syndicates operating in this city, and your brother, in his infinite stupidity, didn't just lose money gambling with them. He witnessed one of their operations, a weapons deal that went wrong, and now they want him dead to ensure his silence, and they want you as leverage to make sure he doesn't go to the authorities." The revelation had hit me like a physical blow, because of course it was worse than I thought. Of course Luca hadn't just gambled away money, but had somehow managed to put himself in the crosshairs of people who killed witnesses without hesitation. And I had felt my legs giving out beneath me, the weight of it all too much to hold. But Dante had been there, his hands catching my arms and steadying me, his touch firm but surprisingly gentle, and he had guided me to the leather couch that probably cost more than a car, and sat beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my head spin. "I've already taken care of your brother," Dante had continued, his eyes never leaving my face, watching my reactions with an attention that felt almost clinical. "He's in a secure location, under protection. The Kozlovs believe he's been eliminated, which keeps them from actively hunting him. And the debt. The 150,000 plus the interest that would have grown to twice that amount in a matter of months. I've paid it in full. Consider it a gesture of good faith." I had stared at him, trying to process what he was saying, because people didn't just pay off debts like that without expecting something in return. Men like Dante Valorian didn't save girls like me out of the kindness of their hearts. And I had found my voice enough to ask the question that was burning in my throat. "What do you want from me? Why would you do all of this for someone you don't even know?" The smile that had crossed his face then was complicated, containing elements of amusement and desire, and something darker that I couldn't quite name, and he had reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek in a gesture that felt both possessive and tender. And when he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times before it happened. I need a wife, Alessia. Not for love or companionship or any of the traditional reasons people marry, but because the Italian families who operate in this territory question my legitimacy. They see me as too young and too ruthless and too American, and they need proof that I respect tradition and can build alliances through proper channels. And you need protection and resources and a way out of the hole your brother has dug for both of you. So I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. I had pulled back from his touch, my mind reeling because this was insane. This was absolutely insane. He was proposing marriage like it was a business transaction, like I was a commodity to be acquired and utilized. And I had shaken my head, words tumbling out in a rush. You can't be serious. You can't expect me to just marry you because you paid off my brother's debt. I don't even know you. This is crazy. It's not crazy. It's practical, Dante had countered, his voice remaining calm and reasonable even as he was suggesting something completely unreasonable. And you do know me, or at least you know enough to understand that I'm offering you something no one else can. Safety for you and your brother, enough money to finish medical school and start your life over once our arrangement concludes, and all I'm asking in return is 1 year of your time, 1 year where you play the role of my devoted wife in public, where you stand beside me at family functions and social events, and present the image of stability and tradition that I need to solidify my position. He had pulled out a leather folder then, opening it to reveal a contract that looked like it had been prepared by expensive lawyers, and he had walked me through the terms with a businesslike efficiency that was somehow more shocking than the proposal itself, explaining that I would live with him, share his public life but maintain my own private space, that he would cover all my expenses and pay off my student loans and provide me with a substantial sum at the end of our year together, that I would be under his protection, which meant no one would dare touch me or threaten me, and that after 12 months, I would be free to walk away with enough money to disappear and start fresh anywhere I wanted. And if I refuse? I had asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though the spray-painted threat in my apartment and the leering Russians and my missing brother made it clear that I didn't really have a choice. And Dante had looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell with him. Then I walk away, and you're on your own to deal with the Kozlovs, who will come back for you the moment they realize you're not under my protection, and your brother, who I can keep hidden indefinitely or release back into a world where he's a marked man. The choice is entirely yours, Alessia. I'm not going to force you into anything, but I need your answer by tomorrow morning, because the window of opportunity to use this arrangement to my advantage is closing, and if you say no, I'll respect that decision and wish you the best of luck surviving what comes next. He had stood then, moving toward what I assumed was the bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back at me with those intense dark eyes that seemed to see straight through all my defenses. And he had added almost as an afterthought, "There's a guest room down the hall where you'll sleep tonight. You're safe here. No one can reach you. And in the morning, you'll give me your decision. But Alessia, I want you to understand something. I didn't orchestrate this situation. I didn't create your brother's debts or put you in danger. But I am offering you a way out. And sometimes in this life, salvation comes from unexpected places, even if it wears a devil's face." I had spent that night in the guest room that was larger and more luxurious than my entire apartment, lying awake in 1,000 thread-count sheets and staring at the ceiling, my mind turning over every word of Dante's proposal, every implication and consequence. And I had known, even as I tried to convince myself otherwise, that I was going to say yes, that I had no real alternative, that the moment I had called his number I had set myself on this path, and when the morning sun had streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in shades of gold, I had found Dante in his kitchen, making espresso with the ease of someone who had learned the art in Italy. And when he had looked at me with those dark eyes that missed nothing, I had taken a deep breath and said the words that would seal my fate. "I'll do it. I'll marry you. But I want it in writing that Luca stays protected, even after our year is up, that he gets a chance to start over somewhere far from here. And I want your word that you won't ask me for anything beyond what's in that contract." The smile that had crossed Dante's face was triumphant and possessive and somehow tender all at once. And he had crossed the space between us in 3 strides, taking my hand in his and pressing a kiss to my knuckles that felt like a brand marking me as his. And he had said in that smooth, dangerous voice that sent shivers down my spine, "You have my word, Alessia. And more than that, you have my protection. And I promise you that by the time our year is finished, you'll understand that sometimes the devil's bargain is the only honest transaction in a world full of beautiful lies." And as I stood there in his penthouse kingdom, watching him produce a pen for me to sign the contract that would make me his wife in everything but truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just sold my soul to the most beautiful monster in Chicago, and the most terrifying part was that some small, traitorous part of me wanted to belong to him in ways that had nothing to do with contracts or protection or survival, and everything to do with the dark hunger I saw reflected in his eyes when he looked at me like I was something precious and dangerous that he intended to keep forever. The transformation from Alessia Romano, struggling nursing student who lived in a 4th-floor walk-up with water-stained ceilings and radiators that clanged in the night, to Alessia Valorian, fiancée of the most powerful and feared Mafia boss in Chicago, happened with a speed that left me dizzy and disoriented, as if I had been picked up by a tornado and deposited in some alternate reality where everything was beautiful and expensive and wrapped in layers of danger so subtle I could barely perceive them, until they were already tightening around me like invisible chains. Dante had moved me into his estate within 48 hours of my signing the contract, and calling it a house would have been like calling the ocean a puddle, because the property sprawled across what must have been several acres in one of the most exclusive areas outside the city, surrounded by walls that were designed to look elegant but were clearly built to withstand assault, with security cameras hidden among the landscaping and guards who patrolled the perimeter with weapons concealed beneath their tailored suits. And every inch of it screamed wealth and power and the kind of paranoia that came from having enough enemies to fill a phone book. My new room, because Dante had been true to his word about maintaining separate private spaces, was larger than my entire previous apartment, decorated in shades of cream and gold with furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace. A walk-in closet that had been filled with clothes in my exact size before I even arrived. Designer labels I had only ever seen in magazines worn by celebrities and socialites, and a bathroom with a soaking tub carved from a single piece of marble that probably cost more than my entire education. And I had stood in the middle of all this opulence feeling like an imposter, like someone playing dress-up in a life that could never truly belong to me. The first person I met from Dante's inner circle was Marco, his underboss, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, and eyes like chips of ice that assessed me with the cold calculation of someone determining whether I was an asset or a liability. And he had made no effort to hide his skepticism about Dante's decision to bring me into their world, his words carefully polite but laced with warning, when he told me that the role I was playing required absolute discretion and perfect performance, because any misstep on my part could create vulnerabilities that their enemies would exploit without mercy or hesitation. Valentina, Dante's sister, had been a different kind of challenge, entirely, sweeping into the estate like a force of nature with her designer clothes and perfectly styled dark hair, and an expression that made it clear she considered me an interloper who had somehow tricked her beloved brother into this arrangement. And she had circled me like a predator sizing up prey, making observations that sounded like compliments, but were clearly designed to highlight every way in which I didn't belong in their world, every gap in my knowledge of their customs and expectations and the intricate social hierarchies that governed the families. "You're very pretty," she had said, her tone suggesting this was actually a criticism, in that fresh, wholesome way that men sometimes find appealing, Though I wonder how long that innocence will last once you understand what my brother really is. What he's capable of when someone threatens what belongs to him. Because make no mistake, Alessia, the moment you put on his ring, you became his property in every way that matters, and Dante is very particular about taking care of his possessions. The third member of Dante's inner circle had surprised me more than the others, because Father Pietro was exactly what his title suggested, a Catholic priest, or at least he had been before he became the Valorian family's consigliere. And there was something deeply unsettling about a man who wore a simple black suit and still carried himself with ecclesiastical dignity while advising on matters of territory disputes and strategic violence. But his eyes, when he looked at me, held something that might have been sympathy or possibly pity, as if he understood better than anyone else what I had signed away when I put my name on that contract. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he had told me during our first private conversation, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had delivered many sermons. And sometimes he places us in situations that challenge everything we believe about ourselves, about morality, about the distance between heaven and hell. But I have watched Dante grow from a traumatized boy into a complicated man. And I believe that you, Alessia, may be exactly what he needs, even if neither of you understands why yet. The days before our engagement party had been a whirlwind of preparations that made my head spin, with Valentina grudgingly taking charge of my transformation from nursing student to Mafia princess, dragging me to appointments with stylists and personal shoppers and etiquette coaches who taught me which fork to use at formal dinners and how to make small talk with the wives of men who killed for a living. And through it all, Dante had been a constant presence, appearing at unexpected moments to check on my progress, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture that looked protective but felt possessive, his dark eyes watching me with an intensity that made my skin heat and my pulse quicken in ways I desperately tried to ignore. He had shown me pieces of himself in those days, late-night conversations in his study where he would pour expensive scotch and tell me stories about his father, about how the old man had built an empire on honor and tradition and blood, about the night when Dante was 19 and had watched rival family members execute his father in their own home, about how he had spent the next decade consolidating power through strategic brutality and calculated mercy, eliminating anyone who showed weakness while rewarding loyalty with a fierceness that inspired devotion, bordering on worship. And I had listened to these confessions with a growing understanding that Dante Valorian was not simply a monster or simply a man, but something more complicated, someone shaped by trauma and necessity into a creature who lived in the spaces between civilization and savagery. In my world, he had explained one night, the Scotch making his accent more pronounced, more Italian, love is the most dangerous weakness you can possess. Because the moment your enemies know what you love, they know exactly how to destroy you, how to apply pressure until you break or betray everything you've built. And so we learn to keep our hearts locked away, to care for nothing so deeply that its loss would unmake us. But the problem, Alessia, is that we're still human beneath all the armor, still capable of wanting things we shouldn't want, feeling things we can't afford to feel. The engagement party itself was held in a historic mansion that Dante's family owned, the kind of place with ballrooms and crystal chandeliers and gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. Except this fairy tale was populated by men in expensive suits who carried weapons and spoke in coded language about territories and arrangements and the delicate balance of power that kept Chicago's underworld from erupting into open warfare. And their wives who wore jewelry worth more than houses, and smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated and judged and determined who was rising and who was falling in the complicated hierarchy of their world. I had been dressed in a gown that Valentina selected, something in deep emerald that clung to my body in ways that made me feel exposed despite being technically modest. And Dante had placed a ring on my finger that morning, an enormous emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the light with every movement. And when I had protested that it was too much, too expensive, too obvious, He had simply smiled and said that his wife needed to look like she belonged to the most powerful man in the city. That the ring was a statement as much as a symbol, a warning to anyone who might think about touching what was his. The party had been going smoothly, or at least as smoothly as an event where everyone was armed and dangerous could go, with Dante introducing me to an endless parade of family heads and their representatives, his hand never leaving my waist, his body language, screaming possession and protection in equal measure. And I had played my part perfectly, smiling and making appropriate small talk, and pretending that my heart wasn't racing with anxiety about saying the wrong thing, or making the wrong gesture, or somehow exposing myself as the fraud I felt like. But then Vincent Carbone, head of one of the smaller but more volatile families, had approached us with too much wine in his system and too much arrogance in his bearing. And he had made some comment about how Dante had chosen well, how I was certainly pretty enough to warm a bed even if my pedigree left something to be desired. And he had reached out to touch my face with his fat fingers, and I had seen something change in Dante's expression, something dark and terrible rising to the surface like a predator emerging from deep water. What happened next unfolded with a terrible speed that left me frozen in shock, because Dante had grabbed Vincent's wrist before his fingers could make contact, with my skin, twisting it with a force that made the older man cry out in pain, and then Dante was dragging him away from the main ballroom and into a side room, and people were following, drawn by the promise of violence like moths to flame. And I found myself being pulled along by Valentina, who whispered that I needed to watch this, needed to understand what it meant to be Dante's wife, needed to see exactly what he was capable of when someone disrespected what belonged to him. The side room had been set up as a coat check, but it became something else entirely as Dante threw Vincent against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. And I wanted to look away, wanted to run from the room and pretend this wasn't happening. But Dante's voice cut through the shocked silence, commanding me to stay, to watch, to understand that this was the price of the protection he offered. This was the reality of the world I had agreed to enter, and so I stood there with my hands clenched into fists and watched as Dante beat Vincent Carbone with his bare hands. It was methodical and brutal, and somehow worse because Dante's expression never changed from that cold, controlled fury, his suit jacket discarded, and his white shirt sleeves rolled up as he delivered blow after blow with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much damage he was inflicting. And Vincent's face became a mask of blood and swelling, his pleas for mercy falling on ears that had heard too many such pleas to be moved by them. And the men watching didn't intervene because this was justice according to the rules of their world. This was what happened when you disrespected a boss's woman. And to interfere would be to suggest that Dante's response was disproportionate, which would be its own kind of insult. When it was finally over, when Vincent was crumpled on the floor making sounds that were barely human, Dante had straightened his clothes with a calmness that was terrifying in its completeness, and he had walked over to where I stood trembling against the wall, and he had cupped my face in hands that were still bleeding from split knuckles, and he had kissed me in front of everyone, claiming me with a possessiveness that made his earlier gestures seem subtle by comparison, his mouth hard and demanding against mine, tasting like expensive scotch and violence, and when he pulled back, his dark eyes searched my face for my reaction, for signs that I was horrified or disgusted or planning to run. But what I felt in that moment was so much more complicated than simple horror. Because yes, I was scared of what I had just witnessed, terrified of the casual brutality that Dante could deploy with such efficiency. But I was also feeling something else, something dark and primitive that responded to his protection, to the fact that he had hurt someone for daring to touch me, to the way he was looking at me now like I was the most precious thing in his world, and I hated myself for that response even as I couldn't deny its existence. Couldn't pretend that some twisted part of me wasn't drawn to this beautiful monster who had just demonstrated exactly how far he would go to defend what was his. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here," Dante had announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room, his arm around my waist pulling me against his side. "Alessia is under my protection. She is my future wife, and anyone who shows her anything less than the utmost respect will answer to me personally. And I promise you that what Vincent experienced tonight will seem merciful compared to what I'll do to the next person who forgets this lesson." The party had resumed after that, though the atmosphere had shifted, becoming more careful, more deferential, with people approaching me with a nervousness that made it clear they had internalized Dante's message. And I had moved through the rest of the evening in a kind of daze, smiling and accepting congratulations while my mind kept replaying the sound of Dante's fists connecting with flesh, the expression of cold fury on his face, the way he had kissed me with hands still bloody from defending my honor. We had left the party sometime after midnight, driven back to the estate in silence that felt charged with unspoken things. And when we arrived home, Dante had walked me to my door, which was when I expected him to leave me alone to process everything that had happened. But instead he had leaned against the doorframe and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something vulnerable showing through the cracks in his usual controlled demeanor. "I know what you saw tonight frightened you," he had said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion or emotion, or possibly both. "And I know that you're probably questioning every decision that led you to this point, wondering if you made a terrible mistake by agreeing to this arrangement. But I need you to understand something, Alessia. Everything I do, every brutal thing, every calculated violence, it's all in service of protecting what's mine, of maintaining the order that keeps this city from tearing itself apart, and now that includes you, which means I would burn the entire world to keep you safe." I had stood there looking at this man who had just beaten someone nearly to death in my defense, this complicated, dangerous man who spoke about violence like it was a necessary tool, and looked at me like I was something sacred, and I had found myself asking a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. What if I told you that what happened tonight, what you did, it doesn't horrify me the way it should? What if I told you that some part of me understood it, maybe even responded to it in ways that make me question everything I thought I knew about myself? The expression that had crossed Dante's face then was triumphant and hungry and almost reverent. And he had stepped closer to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the cologne and scotch and the metallic tang of blood that still clung to him. And his hand had come up to cup my cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such brutality. And he had said in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, "Then I would tell you that you're starting to understand, that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than most people want to admit, that we're all capable of darkness when it serves to protect what we love, and that you, Alessia Romano, you're not as different from me as you want to believe." And then he had kissed me again. But this time it was different from the possessive claiming in front of his associates. This was slower and deeper and somehow more intimate, his mouth moving against mine with a hunger that felt like it had been building since the moment we met. And I had kissed him back with a desperation that should have ashamed me, but instead felt like the most honest thing I had done in weeks, my hands fisting in his shirt and pulling him closer. And when we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I had seen my own confusion and desire reflected in his dark eyes. "Get some rest," he had said, his voice rough and strained, "because tomorrow you start learning what it really means to be my wife, to stand beside me not as a victim or a prisoner, but as a partner. And Alessia, I promise you that before this year is over, you'll understand that the cage I've built around you is gilded with genuine devotion, and that sometimes the most dangerous trap is the one you stop wanting to escape." And with those words hanging in the air between us like a prophecy or a threat, or possibly both, he had turned and walked away, leaving me standing at my bedroom door, with my lips still tingling from his kiss, and my mind racing with the terrifying realization that Dante Valorian was slowly but surely claiming not just my presence or my time, but something far more dangerous. He was claiming my heart, my loyalty, my very sense of self. And the most frightening part was that I was starting to let him. The weeks that followed the engagement party blurred together in a strange dance of domesticity and danger, where I found myself settling into Dante's world with an ease that should have terrified me but instead felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. And every day brought new revelations about the man who had bound me to him with contracts and promises, revealing layers of complexity that made it increasingly impossible to see him as simply a monster or simply a man, but rather as something in between, something uniquely himself. Dante had been true to his word about treating me as a partner, rather than a possession, involving me in aspects of his business that didn't involve direct violence, asking my opinion on charitable initiatives he was planning for the neighborhoods under his protection. And I discovered that his empire wasn't built solely on fear and bloodshed, but also on a strange code of honor that protected the vulnerable and punished those who preyed on the weak. And I found myself attending meetings with community leaders and hospital administrators where Dante donated enormous sums to causes that mattered, always stipulating that the money be used for programs that helped children and families, never for administrative overhead or political campaigns. I had found my own role in his world quite unexpectedly during a tense dinner with the wives of several family heads, women who had initially treated me with the same suspicion and contempt that Valentina had shown. But when the conversation turned to a dispute between two families over territory that was threatening to escalate into violence, I had spoken up with an idea that came from my nursing background, suggesting a neutral zone around the hospital district, where no family business would be conducted because everyone needed access to medical care, regardless of their affiliations. And the women had looked at me with new respect. And later, Dante had told me that my suggestion had been brilliant, that it gave everyone a way to de-escalate while saving face, and that the bosses had agreed to implement it immediately. The social dynamics of the Mafia wives had fascinated me in ways I hadn't expected, because these women wielded their own kind of power through information and social connections. And once they accepted me as one of their own, they began teaching me the intricate language of their world, how to read the subtle signals that indicated shifting alliances, how to plant seeds of information that would grow into strategic advantages, how to use compassion and kindness as tools without being seen as weak. And I realized that I had a natural talent for this kind of social chess, for seeing patterns and connections that others missed, for using my outsider perspective to find solutions that those raised in this world would never consider. But it was the private moments with Dante that truly unmade me. The late nights when he would come to my room after particularly difficult days, his defenses down and his exhaustion evident, and he would lie beside me on top of the covers, fully clothed, just needing the comfort of presence. And we would talk for hours about everything and nothing, about his dreams of legitimizing parts of his empire, about my ambitions to eventually practice medicine in underserved communities, about the impossible situation we found ourselves in, where genuine feelings were growing in the soil of manufactured circumstances. And I learned about the nightmares that plagued him, visions of his father's murder that replayed endlessly, the weight of every decision that resulted in someone's death or imprisonment, the desperate loneliness of being surrounded by people who feared or wanted something from you, but never knowing who actually cared about the man beneath the reputation. The night, everything shifted irrevocably between us, had started like so many others, with Dante appearing at my door after midnight. But this time he looked different, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. And when I asked what was wrong, he had simply said that it was the anniversary of his father's death, that this was always the hardest night of the year. And I had opened my arms without thinking, and he had come to me like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. And what began as comfort transformed into something more desperate and necessary, our mouths finding each other with a hunger that felt like starvation finally being fed. And when we made love that night, it wasn't the calculated consummation of our arrangement, but rather an act of profound intimacy and need, with Dante whispering my name like a prayer and looking at me with eyes that held something terrifyingly close to genuine devotion. And I had given myself to him completely, knowing that I was crossing a line from which there would be no return, acknowledging that what I felt for this complicated, dangerous man had long since stopped being merely attraction or circumstantial attachment, and had become something deeper and more consuming, something that felt dangerously close to love. The morning after, we had lain tangled together in sheets that smelled like us, like the joining of two people who had finally stopped pretending they weren't falling into something neither had planned. And Dante had traced patterns on my bare shoulder, while confessing things I suspected he had never told another living soul, about how he had become obsessed with me months before orchestrating our meeting, how he had watched me from a distance as I sacrificed everything for my ungrateful brother, how he had seen in me a kind of goodness and strength that his world had beaten out of him, how he had manipulated circumstances to bind me to him, because he knew with absolute certainty that I would never choose him freely, that someone like me would never look twice at someone like him if given a real choice. And he had said with heartbreaking honesty that he would rather have me hate him and be alive and his than free and potentially destroyed by the world he inhabited. The confession should have made me furious, should have reinforced every doubt I had ever had about our arrangement. But instead I found myself understanding the twisted logic of it, understanding that in his world, love and possession were often indistinguishable, that protecting someone sometimes meant limiting their choices. And I had kissed him then, silencing his justifications and explanations, and I had told him with complete honesty that yes, he had manipulated me. Yes, he had trapped me. But that somewhere along the way I had stopped being his prisoner and started being his partner by choice, and that whatever had begun as coercion had transformed into something genuine, something I was choosing to embrace despite knowing all the reasons I shouldn't. But our moment of peace and understanding was shattered that very afternoon when Dante's security team burst into the estate with news that sent ice through my veins, because the Kozlov Bratva had discovered that Luca was still alive, hidden in witness protection under Dante's arrangement, and they had found him through a traitor within Dante's own organization, someone who had been feeding information to the Russians for months in exchange for a promise of territory and power, and now they were planning a coordinated attack on both Luca's location and Dante's estate simultaneously, intending to eliminate the witness and punish Dante for his deception and take me as a prize to demonstrate that even the great Dante Valorian couldn't protect everything he claimed to control. The revelation of the traitor had been almost as devastating as the threat itself, because it was Carlo, one of Dante's oldest lieutenants, someone who had served his father and had been present at every major moment of Dante's rise to power, and the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. The evidence of Carlo's duplicity spread across Dante's desk in photographs and bank transfers and intercepted communications that painted a picture of long-term calculated disloyalty. And I watched Dante's face as he processed this information, saw the way something inside him fractured and hardened simultaneously, the last vestiges of the vulnerable man I had held the night before disappearing behind the mask of the ruthless boss who would do whatever necessary to protect his empire and his people. The estate erupted into controlled chaos as Dante mobilized his forces, sending teams to extract Luca from his protected location, while simultaneously fortifying our position and preparing for the assault that intelligence suggested would come within hours. And Marco was orchestrating defensive positions, while Valentina was ensuring that all non-combatants were secured in the reinforced safe room in the basement, and Father Pietro was making calls to allied families asking for support. And through it all, Dante remained eerily calm, his mind working through strategies and contingencies with the cold efficiency of someone who had survived countless such crises. But when he looked at me, something in his eyes betrayed his fear. Not for himself, but for me. For what might happen if his enemies breached his defenses and took from him the one thing he had admitted he couldn't bear to lose. He had tried to send me to the safe room with the others, had insisted that I would be protected there. But I had refused with a stubbornness that surprised both of us, because I understood with sudden crystalline clarity that I wasn't just some civilian to be locked away and protected. I was his wife in every way that mattered now, and that meant standing beside him when the monsters came calling. And more than that, I had skills that could be useful. I was a trained nursing assistant who knew how to treat trauma and manage emergencies, And if this was going to turn into the bloodbath everyone expected, then they would need someone who could keep people alive long enough for the real doctors to arrive. Dante had looked at me for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face for any sign of doubt or fear. And when he found only determination and a kind of fierce loyalty that matched his own, something in his expression shifted, became tender and proud and terrified all at once. And he had pulled me into his arms with a desperation that told me exactly how much I had come to mean to him, how the cage he had built around me had become a cage around his own heart. And he had whispered against my hair that if anything happened to me, if the Kozlovs managed to take me from him, there would be no mercy, no negotiation, no corner of the earth where they could hide from his vengeance, because I had become the one weakness he couldn't afford, but also couldn't survive without. And as the sun began to set and the first reports came in of suspicious vehicles approaching the estate perimeter, I realized that everything, all the manipulation and contracts and carefully constructed arrangements, had led us to this moment where we would either survive together or fall together, and that the hidden strings that had once seemed like bonds of imprisonment had transformed into something far more dangerous and binding. They had become the ties of genuine love, forged in darkness and tested by fire. And whatever happened in the hours to come would determine not just whether we survived, but whether the fragile, complicated, impossibly beautiful thing we had built together could withstand the weight of a world determined to tear us apart. The attack came with the darkness, a coordinated assault that demonstrated exactly why the Kozlov Bratva had maintained their brutal reputation for decades, their forces hitting the estate from 3 different points, simultaneously with a precision that suggested detailed knowledge of our defenses. And the sound of gunfire erupting across the grounds was both terrifying and strangely clarifying, because in that moment, when the choice between fight and flight became real, I discovered that I had already made my decision weeks ago, that I was exactly where I belonged, standing beside a man who had trapped me with manipulation, but had freed me with truth. And as I moved through the chaos with medical supplies strapped across my body, treating wounded security personnel and applying pressure to bleeding wounds while bullets shattered the expensive artwork and antique furniture that had once seemed so important, I understood that I had been transformed by this experience in ways I could never have anticipated or prevented. Dante had been magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, moving through the firefight with a calm efficiency that spoke of too much experience with exactly this kind of violence, directing his forces with hand signals and clipped commands while simultaneously fighting with a skill that reminded me that he had survived and thrived in this world because he was better at violence than almost anyone else. And I watched him take down 3 Russian enforcers who had breached the main hallway with a combination of tactical precision and raw brutality that should have horrified me but instead filled me with a fierce pride, because this dangerous, beautiful monster was mine, and he was fighting with such ferocity because I was what he was protecting, because somewhere in the twisted journey from coercion to genuine connection, I had become his most precious treasure, the thing worth burning the world to defend. The traitor Carlo had revealed himself during the chaos, attempting to unlock the reinforced door that protected the safe room where Valentina and the others were sheltering, and I had been the one who saw him, who shouted a warning that brought Marco running, and the confrontation between Dante and the man who had betrayed him was brief and brutal and final, with Dante's face showing none of the cold control from the engagement party, but instead displaying raw, anguished fury, because this betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, represented a violation of trust that went back to his father's time. And when it was over, when Carlo lay dead from a single bullet that Dante had delivered without hesitation, I saw my husband, because that's what he had become in my heart, regardless of what the calendar said about our arrangement. I saw him lean against the wall, with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking, with something that might have been grief, or rage, or exhausted relief. The turning point of the battle came when Dante's allied families arrived in force, responding to Father Pietro's calls with a speed that demonstrated exactly how much political capital Dante had accumulated through years of careful relationship building. And suddenly, The Kozlov forces found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, their tactical advantage evaporating as reinforcements poured through the gates. And I watched through the window as the Russian vehicles that had been preparing for a final assault instead began retreating, their bosses making the calculated decision that this prize was not worth the cost it was demanding, that Dante Valorian had proven once again why challenging him directly was a losing proposition. But the Russians' retreat didn't mean we had escaped unscathed, because Dante had taken a bullet during the fighting, a through and through in his left shoulder that he had been ignoring with stubborn determination while the battle raged. And it wasn't until the gunfire finally stopped and the estate fell into an eerie silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackling of flames from a section of the house that had caught fire, that I saw the blood soaking through his shirt, spreading in a dark stain that made my heart stop and my training kick in simultaneously. I had forced him into a chair despite his protests that he was fine, that there were others who needed attention first. But the look I gave him must have communicated that I was not accepting any arguments, and as I cut away his shirt and assessed the wound with hands that were steadier than I felt, as I cleaned and packed and bandaged the injury while he watched me with those intense dark eyes that held too many emotions to name, I realized that this moment, this act of caring for him while he was vulnerable and in pain, was somehow more intimate than the passion we had shared the night before. Because this was trust in its purest form. This was him allowing me to see him not as the invincible boss, but as a man who could bleed and hurt, and need someone. "You saved my life," he said quietly, as I finished securing the bandage, his good hand coming up to cut my cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence we had just survived, and I could see in his expression that he meant this in more ways than just the physical wound I had treated, that he was talking about how I had saved him from the isolation and loneliness that had defined his existence before I crashed into his carefully controlled world. The aftermath of the attack brought unexpected consequences that shifted the entire landscape of our arrangement, because the way I had stood beside Dante during the assault, the way I had treated the wounded without hesitation or fear, the way I had proven myself capable of surviving in his world not as a victim, but as a force in my own right, had earned me a respect from his organization and the other families that no amount of carefully orchestrated appearances could have achieved. And when we held an emergency meeting the next day to address the Kozlov situation and plan our response, I was included not as Dante's accessory, but as his true partner, my voice carrying weight in discussions about strategy and consequences. But more importantly, the crisis had forced both of us to confront the truth we had been dancing around for weeks, which was that our arrangement had stopped being an arrangement somewhere along the way, that the contracts and timelines and carefully negotiated terms had become irrelevant in the face of what had grown between us. Something messy and complicated and terrifyingly real. Something that looked like love even though we had both tried to convince ourselves it was anything but. We had been standing in the ruins of his study 3 days after the attack, surrounded by contractors who were beginning the work of repairing the damage, when Dante had pulled out the contract we had both signed, that document that had once seemed so important, so necessary, so binding. And he had looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read before feeding it into the fireplace that was being restored, watching the pages curl and blacken and turn to ash while he said in a voice rough with emotion that he was releasing me from our agreement, that I had fulfilled any obligation I might have had 1,000 times over, that I was free to walk away with everything he had promised and more, that he wouldn't hold me to a contract that had been based on coercion even if it had somehow evolved into something neither of us had expected. I had watched the contract burn, feeling the weight of those terms and conditions disappearing into smoke, and then I had turned to face this man who had orchestrated my captivity and then offered me freedom. This beautiful, complicated monster who had shown me depths of devotion I hadn't known were possible, and I had told him with absolute clarity and conviction that I was staying. Not because any contract demanded it, not because I had nowhere else to go, not because I was afraid of the Kozlovs or needed his protection, but because I chose him. Because I chose this life, because somewhere in the darkness and danger and impossible circumstances, I had discovered that the cage he built around me had never been a cage at all, but rather a sanctuary, and that the hidden strings that had seemed like bonds of imprisonment had actually been lifelines pulling me toward a version of myself I hadn't known existed. Someone strong enough to love a man like Dante Valorian. Someone fierce enough to stand beside him as an equal. Someone brave enough to embrace the darkness that came with the light. Our wedding, when it finally happened 2 months later, was nothing like the engagement party with its political maneuvering and social performance. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony in Father Pietro's church, with only our closest family present. And when Dante slipped a new ring onto my finger, this one designed specifically for me rather than as a statement to his enemies, and when I spoke vows that were real rather than performed, promising to stand beside him in darkness and light, in violence and peace, for, better or worse in a world where worse was often the default setting, I understood that this was what true commitment looked like. Not the fairy tale romance that girls were taught to dream about, but something rawer and more honest. A love forged in fire and tested by betrayal, and strengthened by the choice to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. And so this is how my story transformed from a tale of a poor girl who missed the last bus and made a desperate choice to accept a ride from a stranger in a Maserati into something far more complex and beautiful and strange. A story about how sometimes salvation comes wearing a devil's face, how love can grow in the darkest soil, how the person who traps you can also be the person who sets you free. And as I stand here now, looking back on those terrifying, exhilarating months that changed everything I thought I knew about myself and the world, I understand that the hidden strings Dante's offer came with were not the manipulation, or the contracts, or the carefully orchestrated circumstances, but rather the invisible threads of genuine connection that bind two damaged people together, creating something stronger than either could have been alone. And the most dangerous trap of all was not his scheming or my desperation, but rather the simple truth that sometimes, against all logic and reason and better judgment, the heart chooses what it chooses, and no amount of fear or resistance can change the fact that I was always meant to belong to Dante Valorian, just as he was always meant to belong to me. Two broken pieces that somehow fit together perfectly, creating something whole and fierce and unbreakable in a world that tried its best to destroy us both.